Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you again for joining this keynote session. I'm Jennifer Ho from the Department of English and Communication here at PolyU. And today is my great honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Rodney Jones. Professor Jones is Professor of Sociolinguistics and Digital Media in the Department of English and Applied Linguistics at the University of Reading. And he is also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. His research interests include language teaching, language and AI, and language and creativity. His recent books include Understanding Digital Literacies, A Practical Introduction, which I've seen some of you have cited this work in your presentations as well, Viral Discourse, and Introducing Language and Society. His new book, which I'm very excited to learn about, is called Innovations and Challenges in Digital Literacies, Literacies of Repair, and it will be published by Routledge in October 2025. Without further ado, may we all welcome Professor Jones.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer, for that really kind introduction. And thank you also to the organizers for inviting me to this really important event where academics, policymakers, and teachers all have a chance to come together and share their ideas. Of course, it's always a privilege to talk to policymakers, but it's even more of a privilege to talk to teachers, because you're the people who, year in and year out, have been out there helping us figure out how to deal with the constant disruptions that technology is bringing us, and I have massive, massive respect for you. Today, I want to offer some thoughts about how AI will change the face of language education in both worrying and exciting ways, and how we can capitalize on these developments by, as I put it, going mindfully meta. I should probably point out from the start, though, that I am not working for Mark Zuckerberg. That my idea of going meta will not require you to purchase an expensive pair of virtual reality glasses. My idea of going meta comes from my own field, which is the field of linguistics, but not the brand of linguistics that's just interested in words and grammar, but the kind that's interested in how people use language in the real world, how people change and adapt language when new technologies come along, and also how new technologies and new ways of using language can end up changing people. I have to say, I've been so excited about the conversations that I've heard in these rooms over the past 2 days about AI and language teaching. But I'd like to start out by talking about the conversations that I've been hearing outside of these rooms among language teachers and students of language, both in the UK where I live and also in my travels around China over the past couple of months. Whereas in these rooms, it feels like spring, with many of us here hopeful and enthusiastic about the role of AI in language teaching, many people outside of these rooms think that winter is coming. Across China and the rest of the world, they're worried about whether people value language and language teaching the way they used to. Some believe that thanks to AI, many, if not most people, will no longer feel the need to learn a second language or even to perfect their first language. In fact, every time I open a magazine or newspaper, there are people trying to convince me that someday people like us might become extinct. But it's not just the media. We also see evidence in student enrollments and educational policy. In the US, not only are fewer people signing up to study English, but even the Defense Department has decided to put less emphasis on teaching languages like Chinese and Arabic. And in China, not only have schools and universities lost interest in English, they've also lost interest in Chinese and other humanities subjects as AI surges ahead. And as language education seems to be receding, quite a lot of hope is being placed on artificial intelligence to help students and teachers develop core competencies like critical thinking, cooperation, and communication, which used to be associated with language learning. As many people at this conference have demonstrated, though, there are lots of exciting ways that AI can enhance language learning, from providing our students with 24/7 conversational partners to allowing us to design personalized lessons for all the students in our class. And all of this is true and important and exciting. But it doesn't address the question that too many people outside of these rooms are asking, which is, if we all have chatbots to talk and write for us, why bother to teach and learn language at all? In some ways, you can't blame them because their question arises from a common misunderstanding about language, that language is just about words and grammar rather than about the way we communicate about, understand, and change human minds, human relationships, and human societies. Language is not just a tool for communication. It is, according to Vygotsky, the primary means through which we interface with the world and open the door to developing higher order reasoning. In his book, The Language Animal, Charles Taylor takes this even further, arguing that language doesn't just help us to make sense of the world, but brings into being new meanings and new ways of being. More recent approaches, based on theories of embodied and distributed cognition, propose not just that we learn through language, but that learning itself is a kind of languaging, which is not just verbal and cognitive, but embedded in our environments, embodied, relational, and multimodal, very different from the language generation that large language models engage in. Evidence of the relationship between language and learning is even stronger when it comes to literacy. In her classic Proust and the Squid, Marianne Wolf exhaustively reviews this evidence, discussing how learning to read literally changes the structure of the brain, resulting in increased white matter and greater connectivity between regions, which allows proficient readers to better engage in abstract, reflective, and rational thought. Along with a reading mind, we can also speak of a writing mind, the mind that learns to think critically and abstractly by externalizing ideas in writing. Learning to write has not only been found to increase working memory and cognitive capacity, but the act of physically writing leads to heightened engagement in the parietal lobes and the motor cortex, especially when it comes to writing Chinese characters. But writing doesn't just improve thinking. For many of us, writing is the way we think. As the author Joan Didion famously put it, I write to find out what I'm thinking. Eminent writing scholar Charles Bazerman similarly stated, through writing, we solve novel problems, think new thoughts, and develop new perspectives. Charles Taylor calls this phenomena articulation, the experience of things disclosing themselves to us as we write about them. In his book, More Than Words, composition instructor John Warner takes this even further, seeing writing as an act of embodied thinking, not just a way of generating text, but of enhancing our experience with the world. And while there are definitely ways that AI can facilitate writerly thinking, there are also ways it can jeopardize it. One way has to do with what's called cognitive offloading. Cognitive offloading is not necessarily a bad thing. Humans have long delegated different cognitive tasks, such as calculation and information retrieval, to different tools like calculators and search engines. The problem comes when we offload tasks that humans should be doing, such as critical thinking and reflection. In a recent study involving 386 university students, for instance, Gerlich found that students who used AI most frequently for their schoolwork demonstrated diminished critical thinking skills, and that younger students were the most susceptible to overdependence on AI. Over time, such overdependence can lead to what Natalia Kosmina and her colleagues at MIT refer to as cognitive debt, where external systems come to replace our capacity for effortful thinking, making us less critical, less creative, and more vulnerable to manipulation. In their study, Kosmina and her colleagues used wearable brain scanners to measure the cognitive activities of a group of students who used AI to help them to write essays and a group who didn't. The AI-assisted writers consistently underperformed on neural, linguistic, and behavioral measures compared to those who wrote their essays without the help of AI. The fact is, if we want to be good at critical thinking, we've got to be good at languaging, which includes reading and writing, because it is languaging that enables us to distance ourselves from ideas and provides us the tools to analyze them. But another reason why good language skills are essential for good learning is that they enable us to socialize with one another. And it is in embodied interaction with other humans that we acquire new information, develop joint attention and recursive thinking, and learn to negotiate meaning and adjust our mental models. In fact, it is through embodied talk that the foundations for higher order thinking are laid. But we can also interact with chatbots, which might be a way to supplement human interaction, but can't replace it. Interactions with chatbots lack the embodied cues, contingent responsiveness, and epistemic intersubjectivity that are the hallmarks of human interaction. Zhao and his colleagues, for instance, conducted an experimental study comparing collaborative learning with a human partner versus a chatbot in a secondary school setting, and found that while both conditions supported task completion, the human-human pairs showed significantly higher engagement, deeper reasoning, and richer elaboration of ideas. When we think about learning, of course, we shouldn't just concern ourselves with our students' cognitive development, but also their emotional well-being. One thing that educators all over the world are grappling with is an epidemic of loneliness among young people. And despite suggestions from tech companies that virtual friends on Snapchat might be a way to solve this problem, early indications are that increased interactions with chatbots can actually make people feel even lonelier. It's usually the case with technologies that the greatest affordances also present the greatest dangers. And this is true of the promise of AI for providing our students with more personalized learning experiences, which inevitably means more solitary learning experiences. Mark Pegram argues that instead of using the term personalized learning, we should call it what it is, individualized learning. And he warns that the increased individualization of learning has the potential to undercut decades of pedagogical trends towards collaborative and socially constructivist learning that involves people interacting with other people. So I've talked about the reader's mind, the writer's mind, and the social mind. But another mind, particularly relevant to Hong Kong, is the multilingual mind. The evidence of the benefits of learning languages, apart from being able to communicate with people from other countries, is overwhelming. Bilingual and multilingual people have more developed brains, are more creative, better at self-regulation and multitasking, are less likely to suffer cognitive decline when they get old. I think they might even be better looking. We have a tendency in schools to silo different subjects, assuming that they require from our students totally different skills, but there's a strong possibility that studying English might actually make our students better at maths. Okay, so there's no doubt that language, or as I've been calling it, languaging, is good for learning. But can't AI play a role in making our students better at languaging? And the answer, as we've seen so convincingly at this conference, is most definitely yes. But the problem is that in some of our attempts to use AI in language teaching, we're focusing on the wrong affordances of the technology. As Law points out, many AI language tools are built on rather old-fashioned behaviorist principles of language learning, involving things like drills, automated translation, and grammar correction. A good example of this is Duolingo. In other words, many approaches to using AI in language teaching focus on the surface level of language rather than on those aspects of languaging that really improve learning. Back in 2023, Azevedo and Wiedbusch observed that in most AI-driven learner modeling, there is a widespread neglect of essential learning processes such as motivation, emotion, and metacognition. Judging from some of the fantastic presentations I saw yesterday, however, this is rapidly changing, which is great because actually these are the things that AI just might be best suited to enhance. But it requires that we stop thinking of AI as language machines, machines that generate language, and start thinking of them as languaging machines, machines which provoke a more motivated, effective, and metacognitive engagement with language. And when we do, we will realize not only that language education is still important, but that it is more important than ever before, because using AI successfully demands precisely this kind of motivated, effective, and metacognitive engagement with language. What AI demands of us as language teachers and of our students is that we go meta. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, what I mean by going meta is not buying a pair of meta sunglasses that can translate for us in real time whenever we're speaking to a foreigner. Actually, Xiaomei has even a better version. The lenses change color. I don't know if you've seen that one. What Meta promises with this product is what they call seamless communication. But this is actually the very opposite of going meta. Going meta is more about seamful communication. Communication in which we become more aware of all the causes, conditions, and contingencies that make human communication and human relationships possible, and involves not just being able to listen and speak and read and write, but to be able to reflect on and critically engage with those processes through which such things as meta-language, meta-discourse, understanding how communication is structured, meta-pragmatics, understanding how we use language to manage social identities and social relationships, all of which form the linguistic basis of metacognition. In fact, metacommunication is a prerequisite for metacognition, and they are both prerequisites for the development of creativity, criticality, and self-awareness. The most important thing about going meta is that it's not an individual, solitary activity, but a social practice. The educational linguist James G. describes what players of multiplayer video games do when they work together to plan strategy and figure out how to hack the game as going mindfully meta, which involves not just consciously seeking to understand how things work, but also being able to articulate that understanding in language and being able to work with others to use that understanding to advance their collective knowledge, a process that gamers call theory crafting. This idea of going mindfully meta changes the whole way that we approach AI. For most people, as technologist Nate Jones points out, AI is used as a way of compressing knowledge, summarizing, transcribing, correcting, offloading cognition, rather than expanding knowledge, onloading cognition. What would happen, he asked, if instead of seeing AI as a way to make things easier, we used it as a way to make things harder? as a weight machine for the mind. So what opportunities does AI offer to help our students to go meta? Well, not surprisingly, the main ones have to do with the opportunities AI provides for getting them to engage in meta-languaging, provoking them to reflect on how they talk to AI, how they talk through AI, and how they talk about AI. Maybe the best thing about AI is that it gives us an opportunity to talk to an entirely different kind of entity, one which, although it sometimes seems human, demands that we talk to it in very different ways than we talk to humans. In some ways, it's like learning a new language. And those who are good at talking this new language can actually make a lot of money. But the most important thing about talking to AI is not just that you need to know about AI, but you also need to know what you're talking about. It may surprise you that one of the most in-demand university degrees these days is art history. Because with more and more graphics firms using AI-powered image generators where people basically use words to create art, suddenly there's a huge demand for people who can talk about art. So one good thing about talking to AI is that it provokes us to ask if we know what we're talking about. And when we don't, well, the AI just doesn't work that well. But in the context of going mindfully meta, it's not just about having an understanding of what we want to use AI to find out or to produce, but to be able to articulate that through language. Sometimes we refer to what we're doing when we talk to AI as prompting or even prompt engineering. But what it really is meta-languaging and metacognition. All of these techniques people talk about for getting the best output from large language models are also ways to get us to think about what we are saying and think about what we are thinking. What's known as few-shot prompting, giving the model an example of what we want it to do, requires that we are able to produce some version of what we want it to do ourselves. Chain of thought and tree of thought prompting, in which we explain to the model how to think step by step, requires that we understand how to think step by step. And persona prompting, in which we assign a role or personality or attitude to the model, requires that we have some meta-pragmatic awareness and understanding of how people with different roles and personalities and attitudes talk. Most meta of all is meta-prompting, prompting the AI to write prompts for you, which requires that we figure out how to give instructions to the model for how to give instructions to itself. When we think about prompting as a means of going meta, we help students to move away from the idea that the purpose of prompting is to find out answers to their questions, and towards the idea of prompting as a way to reflect upon their own thought processes, or, if you will, to find out questions to their answers. According to Hendrickson and Morono-Penuela, our focus in teaching students how to talk to AI should not just be on them learning how to optimize the system's output, but also learning how to optimize their own uses of these systems through explicit discussions about how we come to make meaning and what it means to be a co-creator of AI-generated language. But just seeing our encounters with AI as a matter of input and output, rather like the way we use search engines, is a dead end. It misses the main affordance of these systems, which is to help us to engage in dialogues, to critically assess the AI's output and talk back to it, telling it what we think of it and the way it's designed, and not just to do that, but to iteratively improve the output and to iteratively improve the way we think about the kind of output we want. As Kumar and his colleagues argue, it is in dialogues with AI that students can find opportunities to develop both critical thinking and self-reflection. But often these dialogues have to be scaffolded, sometimes by teachers, sometimes by other learners. One of my favorite methods is the one developed by Sperber and his colleagues, in which students engage in peer feedback sessions with AI models and classmates at the same time, critically comparing the feedback they get from the models with that they get from humans and compelling their classmates and the AI to justify where they differ. This activity, according to the researchers, prompted learners to engage in conversations about learning strategies, the nature of writing, and what good feedback actually looks like. The second way that AI can be used to encourage meta-languaging and metacognition is getting students to think about how they talk through AI. We know that many teachers are worried that students will use AI to talk for them, which some of them will. But when most students use AI, they're more likely to think of themselves as talking through AI, using it to somehow refine or animate their thoughts. But understanding who is actually talking through whom is a tricky business, one which surfaces fundamental issues around things like authenticity, honesty, authorial voice, and textual ownership. These are not just ethical questions. They are practical questions of rhetoric. Alan Knowles, a scholar of rhetoric, takes the issues around cognitive load and cognitive offloading that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk and applies them to rhetoric. When students use computers to help them to write, he says, the real issue is not so much who's doing most of the work as it is who is bearing the rhetorical load, whose ideas and whose voice comes to steer different parts of the process. In some cases, he says, students are using AI in what he calls a human-in-the-loop situation, in which most of the rhetorical load is carried by the machine, and the human is there to monitor or correct the machine's thinking and writing. And at other times, they arrange things so that they are carrying most of the rhetorical load themselves, and the machine in the loop is there to help to support their thinking and give suggestions on how to correct their writing. Neither of these situations is inherently bad. Both have pedagogical value for the student, helping them to master different skills, and each might be appropriate for different situations. But the most important thing, Knowles says, is that this human-machine loop is dynamic. It doesn't just change from one writing situation to another, but also at different stages in the same writing situation. The good thing about getting students to write with computers is not that it makes their writing better or that it makes their writing worse, but that it puts them in a situation of having to figure out how they fit into the human-machine loop, forcing them to choose moment by moment how much they want to give the machine a voice and how much they want to assert their own voice. Another way to think of this is through the model of production formats developed by the American sociologist Irving Goffman. Whenever we speak or write, Goffman says, we assume different production roles. We might be the principal, the owner and originator of the ideas, or the author, the one who figures out how best to express the ideas of the principal, or just an animator, someone who repeats the words of others. Or we might assume more than one of these roles at the same time. When you get your students to reflect on which of these roles they are taking when they use AI, on where they are in a piece of writing, you get them to start thinking about what it means to be a writer or to be in a piece of writing. And when you get them to ask which of the roles the AI is playing, you can also get them to start thinking more critically about where the AI's ideas are coming from. Who is speaking through the AI? Who is speaking through the training data? What kinds of assumptions and biases are built into the AI's processes of authoring and animating? These kinds of provocations work best when you introduce a third party. Actually, it's the most important party into the loop, the audience. Questions about authorship and authenticity change dramatically when, rather than telling our students to write something, you tell them to write to someone. Showing your students what happens when you get ChatGPT to write something to a real person can be revealing, such as this email it wrote, congratulating a colleague on achieving a milestone. Subject, congratulations on your milestone achievement. Dear colleague's name, I wanted to take a moment to extend my heartfelt congratulations to you on your recent milestone achievement. Would you really write this email? It's when you ask ChatGPT to write to real people that the voicelessness of AI becomes dramatically evident. But the good thing about it is that it provides a way to provoke students to take a text like this and put their own voice into it, or prompt the model to talk to their friend in a way that they think she would like to be talked to. The last opportunity to go meta I want to talk about involves getting students to focus on how they and others talk about AI. This is an aspect of AI literacy that we often ignore, but as the famous Chinese AI pioneer Fei-Fei Li said, what we say about AI shapes what we build, and what we build reflects who we are. Paying attention to how we talk about AI and the imaginaries we build up around it is important for two reasons. First, studies have shown that whether or not we imagine AI as, for example, cooperative or manipulative or friendly or formal impacts how we use it. But a more important reason is that reflecting on how we think about AI is a gateway to understanding how we think about ourselves and the things that are important to us as a society. AI is an example of what Timothy Morton calls a hyper-object, an object that forces us to rethink things like knowledge, ethics, aesthetics, and even our very humanity. Much of the way we talk about AI is influenced by what I call hegemonic imaginaries, often overly simplistic representations of AI that are promoted by tech companies, which distract us from talking realistically, both about AI's potential dangers and about its most useful benefits. One thing I like to do is ask students to collect images of AI from sites like Google Images, where you invariably find it pictured as a white robot doing things that people usually do. This picture, for instance, is meant to portray AI in education. And it tells us a lot, not just about how people think of AI, but also about how people think about education, with the AI taking the role of teacher and the students reduced to identical virtual images projected on computer screens. Bear in mind that this picture itself is AI generated, which means that it represents a synthesis of how AI in education is imagined in the model's training data. In fact, most of the time when you ask image generators to represent AI in education, the AI imagines itself as the teacher. But is this really the best future we can imagine for ourselves? And does it really show the transformation of education that everyone is talking about, or is it just a rehearsal of traditional teacher-centered classrooms run by robots instead of people? It's hard for us not to talk about AI as if it were human, because that's the way people who make AI talk about it. Tech companies, for example, call instances where AIs output false information hallucinations. The problem with this way of talking is not just that it anthropomorphizes AI, but also that it treats AI inaccuracies as some kind of rare aberration, something exceptional, when actually inaccuracy is not just a common problem with AI-generated output, it is actually inherent to the way AI works by creating the most plausible-sounding text possible with little regard for accuracy. Some people insist that we need to stop talking this way, that we need to invent a new language for talking about AI that emphasizes its machine nature. And the European Union has even gone so far as publishing a glossary of politically correct ways to talk about AI. Others are less bothered about talking about AI as if it were a person. Ethan Mollick, head of the AI lab at Wharton Business School, argues that to make the most of these models, you shouldn't just treat them as humans, but also tell them exactly what kind of human you want them to be. One reason this improves their performance is that it gives them more context. But another reason is that it improves our performance at prompting them. We are better at talking when we have a clear idea of who we're talking to. The truth is, whether or not it's good to talk about AI as if it were a person and what kind of person we should imagine it to be, is that it depends on whether it's useful or not in particular situations. What do we stand to gain from particular ways of talking about AI? What do we stand to learn? The most important thing about talking with students about the way they talk about AI is that it pushes them to reflect on what it means to be a person and what it means to be intelligent. We might call this meta-imagining. Back in the 1980s, mathematician Seymour Papert argued that the reason computers are good for education is not that machines can think, but that they are machines to think with. Objects that help students learn about thinking. And the best way to spark this meta-imagining with our students is not to impose on them our own imaginaries about AI and what it's good for, but to let them experiment themselves with different ways of imagining AI and experience the benefits and consequences of these imaginaries. Back in the early 60s, before ChatGPT, even before personal computers, Seymour Papert had a conversation about artificial intelligence with the prominent psychologist Jean Piaget. In recounting this conversation, Papert said, "We engaged in playful speculation about what would happen if children could play at building little artificial minds. I had been saying that the essence of AI was to make theoretical psychology concrete. So, in principle, perhaps some elementary form of it could become a children's construction set. If psychologists could benefit from making concrete models of the mind, why shouldn't children whose needs were even greater also benefit?" This is perhaps the best way to talk about AI, not as some artificial teacher that we impose on students, but as a construction set that we provide them with to create for themselves different educational experiences. There are lots of ways to spark this kind of student-centered learning with AI. With younger students, you might use apps like Google's Teachable Machine, which positions students as teachers of AI rather than the other way around. For older students, you might get them to try their hands at vibe coding on platforms like Lovable. Since vibe coding is basically coding with language, it's a good example of real-life languaging with just-in-time consequences. But one of the easiest ways to spark meta-imagining about AI is to use the tools in ChatGPT and other large language models to get students to create their own custom chatbots, giving them a chance to imagine what kind of AI they want to learn with. If you don't have a paid subscription to ChatGPT, PoE also has the same functionality. And this is the approach we've been taking at the University of Reading, in a project designed to empower students and teachers to take control of the way AI is used in their own classrooms. In the projects, teachers and students from different disciplines like English, graphic design, and business studies come together in maker spaces to collectively create AI-powered learning solutions for actual learning challenges they have in their particular disciplines. This idea of maker spaces or DIY learning has a long history in literacy studies, especially digital literacy studies. The whole idea being to transform learners from users of technologies to tinkerers and creators of technologies. Our goal should be to get students to think of themselves not as users of AI, but as makers of AI. In briefing maker teams about how to write instructions for their chatbots, we always ask them to answer the following questions about their AI. Who do I want it to be? What do I want it to do? What do I not want it to do? How do I want it to talk? And what does it need to know? And if they think it needs to know specific information, they can always upload things like class notes or rubrics or data sets into the chatbot's knowledge. But in order to answer these questions, they've also got to converse with one another about meta questions, such as, what do I want to learn? How do I want to learn it? How do I not want to learn? How can I use language to get the AI to understand what I want? How much of me and how much of the AI do I want to see in the output? And how can I imagine AI as a tool to think with? How can I use AI to do hard things? That is, how can I use it to expand knowledge rather than compress knowledge? And during these sessions, we've been taking screen recordings of their activities and audio recordings of how they talk to one another. And what we've been finding is that this idea of interfacing or talking to AI is really quite complex. One thing we found that's interesting is not just how they move back and forth between different parts of the ChatGPT interface, each window demanding of them different linguistic and metalinguistic skills, but another interesting thing is how in this setting, talking to AI also requires that they talk to each other or interact with other interfaces like search engines, course notes, or other references, creating a realization that talking to AI is not a simple dyadic conversation that we usually imagine it to be, but a more like a multi-party polylogue involving multiple human and non-human voices interacting, including all the voices in the AI's training data. When it comes to talking through AI, what's striking is how it's not just a matter of managing the human-machine loop, but a more active process of meta-languaging, where participants iteratively tested the system and critiqued its output in a kind of adversarial way, giving it slightly off-the-wall prompts or being strategically ambiguous to test its limits. And then, based on the system's outputs, going back and reverse engineering what happened, turning their critical capacities onto their own prompts. But one of the most interesting things was watching them engage in acts of imagining what kind of agent they wanted their ChatGPT to be, spending lots of time on things like trying to tweak the style in which the GPT talked. But imagining was not just a matter of creating persona for the AI, but also about creating persona for themselves. Some groups, for example, passed the laptop around to test their model out, pretending to be different kinds of users, each competing with each other to impersonate the most idiosyncratic user they could imagine. We've also been interviewing participants, and here are some of the things they said which underlie the points I've been making about the value of going meta. One said, "You can use AI to make AI. That for me is a game changer." Another said, "I can actually create my own experiences with this thing, which is something I never thought about before." Here's an interesting one. "At first I thought you wanted us to create like an API to connect ChatGPT to some app. But after this, it seems like I'm the API. We're the API." And here's my favorite one. "I understand what ChatGPT is really giving me here. I used to think it was giving me the answer like it could paint the picture for me. But now I see that what it's giving me isn't the painting, it's the paintbrushes." Ethan Mollick describes AI as a jagged frontier. It's a frontier because it's new. And it's jagged because we're still in the process of discovering what AI is good at. And if you engage your students seriously in navigating this jagged frontier, chances are they'll also find ways to discover what they are good at. So what should we as teachers and scholars and policymakers be mindful of as we try to help students go mindfully meta along this jagged frontier? Let me leave you with 4 thoughts. First, do your best to involve students in co-designing AI-powered learning experiences. Second, redesign assessments to prioritize metacognition and reflection. Third, and this is thanks to Mark Pegram, stop talking about the AI revolution in education and start talking about the evolution of education with AI. And fourth, remember the words of computer scientist Fei-Fei Li. We need to go beyond metrics and ask, what kind of world do we want this AI to help us to build. Oh, and one more thing. Take off those AI glasses for a moment so that you're able to look at them rather than through them. Thank you.